Alright class, how's it going? So this is Mr. Miles coming at you. Today we're going to talk about how photosynthesis and cellular respiration work together even though they exist inside of different organisms. We're going to talk about how they are linked together by the processes that they perform. Now if you remember from photosynthesis, we have these things called chlorophyll. These things live inside of the chloroplasts, which is an organelle inside a plant cell, and chlorophyll are the little green pigments. Well, these things, the chlorophyll, actually absorb sunlight. So here's our jolly Mr. Sun. And these chlorophyll absorb the sunlight that comes down, and it helps it to produce energy. And this little E will stand for energy. Well, the chloroplasts, what they do is they take H2O, which is water, and they'll actually split that water. So they split the hydrogen and they split the oxygen. So the oxygen goes off and it becomes waste. The hydrogen, on the other hand, will come and combine with CO2, which is carbon dioxide, and it combines these two to produce glucose, which, as you can remember, is sugar. Now, the way that this happens is because it gets that energy, so this little E energy, actually helps the hydrogen and the CO2 combine, and there's a whole process that's involved there. So that chlorophyll is really important so that energy can be produced so that hydrogen and CO2 can meet to make glucose. And you can see that the water is important because the oxygen is leaving as waste, but you need those hydrogens. And the CO2, the thing that plants take in, is really important because, again, if it doesn't bond with the hydrogen, you don't get the glucose. Now let's look at how cellular respiration works. Well, cellular respiration, pretty much what it does is it will use its organelles to create energy through ATP. Sorry, I'm saying so much. Well, what it does is it takes glucose or other molecules that it eats from animals, and it brings it inside of a cell, and in the cytoplasm, it can break it down to produce something called ATP. And when it does it in the cytoplasm, it'll produce 2 ATP. Well, it'll take this energy that it has, and it puts it into the mitochondria. And you remember the mitochondria, it looks kind of like this when you open it up. It puts it into the mitochondria, and when it goes through there, it can actually produce 38 ATP. So you can see that it can produce a lot more when the mitochondria takes it in. And a way that it does this is it actually needs this oxygen over here that is given off as waste in order to do that. Now, as it's performing that, it'll give off something called CO2. And where did we see that before? Oh yes, the thing that this needed. So you can see how it's trading it back and forth. Photosynthesis, its waste is oxygen. We breathe it in. It goes to our mitochondria to help produce enough ATP to keep us alive. And then we kick out CO2 as waste that needs to go to photosynthesis in order to bond with the hydrogen to create glucose. So you can kind of see how those two are linked together and how it helps keep plants and animals alive and how they kind of work together. Now looking back at cellular respiration, you can remember, you can see here that 2 ATP isn't enough to keep us alive. With 2 ATP, eventually we die because this is what happens when you're trying to create energy with a lack of oxygen. Because remember, oxygen only takes place once we're in the mitochondria. So, like I said in class, the best way to visualize what would happen if your mitochondria stopped working is it would be the same as if you held your breath. Because when you hold your breath underwater or above water, either way, you're not taking in any oxygen. And so eventually, when you run out of oxygen, you can't create this 38 ATP that you need to survive. Instead, you're only making 2. And 2 per cell isn't enough to keep it alive, and eventually all your organ systems shut down. It doesn't have enough energy. Alright, so let's see if we can get this thing to like me enough to delete it. I've been having a lot of trouble earlier today. So we can go back to brushes. Yay! It's a smiley face because I wasn't getting it working. Now, we're going to run into something else when you get into a place that has a lack of oxygen. So in some cases you can get organisms that are still able to produce energy. Now, these organisms obviously have to be small, because if they're only producing a little amount of ATP, because you see what happens if you don't have that oxygen, you need to be a very small organism. And so yeast, as a type of fungus, can do this. Without oxygen in its environment, it can go ahead and it can create its own energy. And so if you want to follow along, this is one of those ones I want you guys to follow along with. On page, sorry, opening it up to it right now. Taking forever. On page 54, we can come across something called fermentation. And in this case, where you have a lack of oxygen, we're going to have alcoholic fermentation. And alcoholic fermentation, this is, again, like I said, it's going to happen in yeast, and it's when you have a lack of oxygen. It's how it still is able to produce energy. And so it'll use the carbon dioxide in order to give itself energy. And that's why you have bread rise, is because that's all the carbon dioxide produced as it makes energy. That's its waste. Because remember, I said that whenever something performs, exerts any type of energy, it's always going to have a waste associated with it. Now, speaking of that associated waste, let's also talk about our muscles. Now, in muscles, when they work, they give off a waste called lactic acid. And what lactic acid is lactic acid is just, again, that waste. And that's what builds up inside your muscles and gives you cramps and gives you that soreness. Now, oxygen ordinarily would help take that lactic acid away. But when you work out a lot, when you have a very strenuous workout, you're building up more lactic acid than you can take in oxygen. And that's why you start to breathe a lot heavier when you're working out or when you're exercising, anything like that, is because this lactic acid is trying to be removed by your body, and so it's trying to take in more oxygen. Well, eventually you get to that point where no matter how fast you're breathing, you can't get rid of lactic acid, and that's where soreness comes in, and that's why for a few days after, you could possibly be sore because that lactic acid buildup is still there, and the oxygen is just slowly still taking it away. So that's what that is, and that's why when you watch the NFL, you can see like those big old linemen, if they make any big plays and run all the way down the field, they give them the oxygen masks to help them out. So all right, well that's photosynthesis, cellular respiration, and fermentation. So if you have any questions, make sure you email me or let me know in class, and we get you squared away on that.